Okay, this is the V Spot. I'm Dr. Victator. I'm getting to talk for a third time to comic book writer Gerry Conway. Gerry, the last time we spoke, way back in 2013, I guess we were talking about your time at DC on Firestorm, and we never really got to talk about your second run at Marvel. You had left DC around, I guess it would have been 87 or 88, wouldn't it?
I think so, yeah. Well, maybe, around 80, 86, 87, somewhere in there, yeah.
Okay, you ended up back at Marvel on the Spider-Man books, I guess what you'd call the B and C books, Spectacular and Web.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well, I originally actually started doing some work for Marvel on some of their third-tier type titles. Like, I think I worked on Thundercats. I did some work with a guy named Mark Bagley on Visionaries. I did some work on the New Universe titles. And after a while, Jim Salicrup asked me to come over and write some Spider-Man stories, and that turned into the regular assignments on Spectacular and Web.
Okay, now one of the interesting things when I'm reading the book is, because when you're doing Spectacular and Web, you really can't you can't do a lot with necessarily the main cast, because Amazing's always going to be the first tier book.
Right.
And Spider-Man has such a deep cast of characters that's not necessarily a problem, because you were able to use characters that had been maybe neglected, like Robbie Robertson.
Right. Well, that was part of my master plan, and what I talked to Jim about doing was to treat Web and Spider-Man as a bi-weekly comic, and to focus our attention on the second tier of supporting characters and the second tier of villains, because we knew that the main storyline for Spider-Man was going to be taking place in Amazing, and we couldn't really affect that storyline.
Right.
So this was a way to keep it in a nice little box.
The first you brought in a second Tarantula, because the original one that you had introduced in Amazing was, I think, killed during Roger Stern's run on the title. So you brought in a new one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I tried to bring in. There were two types of things I would do. I would try to bring in the second level or third level Spider-Man characters, like the Beetle, people like that, and at the same time create some new characters that I could use to expand the stories, and expand the series.
No.
And still give it a sense of consequence, even though it wasn't dealing with the main the main storylines.
That was one thing I wanted to say, and again, I hate to sound like I'm gushing or something, because but I enjoy these books so much, and I'm a amateur writer, but I enjoy it, and that's the only thing that matters to me. But I just enjoy seeing somebody at their craft, and what I noticed is you were able to introduce new characters into the stories and make me as a reader care for them. So even if I know that Peter or Mary Jane can't die, the woman from the country whose name I can't remember, like, you would worry for her and her family because she could die.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's sort of, if you think of comic books in the way that television used to be developed in the 60s and 70s, you had your main characters who were going to go from episode to episode and nothing was going to happen to them. But you could introduce, supporting characters whose stories could have consequences. I mean, the bad version of that is all the doctor shows where you don't know if the patient's going to live or die. Or the detective shows where, maybe the character who's being helped, might be thrown in jail, and the detective has to get them out, and so on. So, I mean, it's a way to keep the stakes realistic without, creating a fundamental disconnect, jeopardy that could come to any of the main characters in the second-tier books.
What I did notice also is, that the theme of the Tarantula story was a lot about immigration, and the thing I noticed is that unfortunately, the theme of the story is just as relevant today as it would have been in 1988, maybe more so.
Right. Well, I mean, this is an ongoing issue in America. We have a very conflicted attitude towards immigrants. Even though we are, in fact, a nation of immigrants, the only people here who are naturalized citizens will be Native Americans. So the rest of us are all here by hook or by crook. And as a Irish American whose grandparents were immigrants, and who their story is one that I see played out, in the story of Hispanic and Arabic immigrants. I feel fairly strongly, a fairly strong amount of sympathy for them. So there's this it is an ongoing problem, and in the 1980s there was an attempt to deal with it through some comprehensive immigration reform, and even Ronald Reagan was trying to push it, and it just didn't happen. So once again, people are left, in a kind of undecided, bad situation. It's just, and they're used as scapegoats and bounced around and treated, as non-people. So I think that's always a valid area for storytelling.
One thing I found interesting about it is the second part of the story, the people from, and again, I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly. I know I think it was a Marvel country, a made-up country that they used to translate.
Well, yeah, it was a Marvel.
Right,
it was a made-up country.
So they bring in Captain America, and during this period, it was the John Walker Captain America, and a lot of writers, and I think this, necessarily, a lot of writers might have tried to gloss over the fact that John Walker, that it wasn't Steve Rogers, but you really played with the ideal that John Walker really didn't know what was going on. And you didn't play him as being a boob, necessarily, he just didn't know Spider-Man.
Right. Well, I maybe because I'm not, part of the even then I was not part of the regular Marvel writing staff. I was a freelancer doing 2 books a month for them. I didn't, I wasn't part of the Marvel mindset, so I don't know that I really understood how they were treating the character at that point. So I would just write him the way it would seem most logical to me.
I thought it really worked because I read the Cap books from that period. You gotta understand, I didn't start reading comics really till 1991 or 92, but as you may know, comics from that period aren't, I don't want to say they're necessarily bad, but it wasn't exactly a golden age. So as a kid, I read a lot of 80s books.
Right.
Just finding them, but, I found that it really did work with John Walker, and I thought John Walker kind of did a good job, because if it was Steve Rogers in that story, it would be a different story, because, number one, he wouldn't have been fooled by Tarantula for a minute.
Right.
And number two, Walker kind of represented the like you said earlier about the conflicted view of America on immigrants in the modern day.
Well, I think Steve Rogers would have felt a similar conflict, because the way that Steve Rogers has been played over the years has been, as the awkward symbol of America, where he knows that he is a symbol. And should be the best, symbol of America that he can be. But at the same time, he's a human being, and he knows that he's a flawed person. So there's a nice balance there, where he's always trying to live up to, the standards that have been thrust upon him by fate. But Walker doesn't have that history, so it becomes a little more problematic for him.
Right. Now, around this time, and I want to get into this because I know it's a big thing, and it kind of became an issue a few years after you left. The Evolutionary War annuals. you brought back the Gwen clone.
Yeah.
And what I found very interesting about that is that I really like the conflict in Peter and Mary Jane's relationship because of it, because Gwen holds a piece of Peter that Mary Jane I don't think would ever be able to touch. That doesn't mean he doesn't love Mary Jane. It just means there's a part of him, And it was I just thought it was a very human touch to it, that Peter feels guilty because he still loves Gwen. I think.
Right.
He feels like, it's like you're cheating on someone with a ghost.
Well, the thing is, that I think represents my growing sophistication of understanding human relationships. People operate on a variety of levels, and we can't always choose the person that we can't make a choice about our emotions. We can choose how we act on our emotions.
Right.
Our emotions.
Exactly.
Our emotions are our feelings. They're feelings. And Peter, because of the nature of Gwen's departure from his life, regardless of any guilt that he might feel, there's unresolved emotional feelings, and that was a good opportunity to address those in the story. And I think that that to me was the saving grace of that story, which I probably would not have done that, except my editors thought it would make it for a good story idea for the the annual, and I was just I was happy to leave that whole conflict, in the past, and that whole storyline in the past. But hey, you're a writer. You're working for people, and you basically take their direction if it's not something that you're horribly opposed to.
Okay, when you had the ideal that basically the story said that Jackal or Miles Warren was not capable of creating a clone from whole cloth, is that something? Were there parts of the original Clone Saga that you might have regretted years later?
No, I think that was a rationale to be able to bring in the High Evolutionary.
Right.
It was. I think that the Clone Saga, when you come right down to it, it's all very highly improbable. But everything in comics is highly improbable. So, the High Evolutionary is not necessarily any more or less improbable than Miles Warren. So I didn't have a problem with the original rationale, but it made sense for the purposes of that story. And then, of course, it becomes a whole other issue when you start developing the Clone Saga that they told in the 90s.
Yeah. Did you keep up with that any to see how they tried to explain that part? Or did you just not hold any interest?
No, I have a pretty strict policy that when I leave a book, I stop reading it.
Yeah.
Because it's just there's no purpose. I am a comic book fan. And when I say I stop reading it, it's not that I don't come back to it eventually, but I don't try to figure out what I don't follow what people who are following me are doing, because it's just
it would be an exercise in frustration.
I have the way I would tell a story. Somebody else has the way they would tell a story. Both ways are valid. There is no one right way to do something. And if I feel a certain personal attachment to my own ideas, which I do, I could get frustrated or upset with someone for not following that, and that's unfair to them. They're entitled, just as I was entitled to come onto Spider-Man and do the stories that I wanted to do, regardless of what direction Stan might have been intending to go. Someone who comes onto a book after me has every right to, completely redo what I did and redefine it. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And, that's their privilege.
Now, around this time also, the Inferno crossover started, and aside from the main X-Men parts, I really loved your stories on Inferno, because you kind of show, because I think some people have a limited view of Spider-Man, but it seemed like you showed that Spider-Man can be put into a lot of different stories, as long as you maintain a core of Peter Parker.
Yeah, I think that's true. I know that my preference is that there's a certain kind of story story I like to see and read with Spider-Man. But I think as a character, sometimes it's really fun. Although I think it's been done far too often in the last decade or so, to take him and put him into situations where he's a fish out of water. You put him in a big X-Men mutant story. That can be kind of cool. But the third or fourth time, he's taken out of the streets of New York and tossed into an intergalactic war. It's just not as impressive, So.
I was reading the story you did, Night of the Living Dead, and that was a very good issue. But you know what? I was thinking at the end of it, when Betty blew up the Flash's gas heater, and it blew up his apartment, and a few minutes later, the X-Men managed to defeat the demons, and New York went back to normal. I couldn't help but Flash thinking, Betty, if you'd wait a few minutes, maybe I'd have an apartment.
Yeah. Well, that's the fun. I mean,
yeah.
One of the things that's great about Spider-Man is that when he's done, in the traditional way, he's a guy who has to deal with the outcomes of being a superhero. Even though a lot of superhero characters now are treated that way, he was the first one where, if he missed, if he got into a battle with the Sandman, it could end up costing him, a good grade on a high school chemistry paper. It's like there was a sense of consequence, in the daily life. That was fun about that character. The idea that battling these bad guys could end up with him being homeless. That's a fun part of that character. So yeah, I always liked that aspect of it.
And again, I thought that was a very effective story because it kind of, with the horror elements of it. One thing I didn't want to ask about was the Hobgoblin, or Jason Masondale. I don't think he was being used that often in Amazing. Whose ideal was it to turn him into a demon?
I don't know. It was I got a lot of direction from Jim Salicrup, my editor. We were fairly collaborative. I was mostly interested in the side stories. The stories going on with Mary Jane's cousin, with Robbie Robertson and Tombstone. Gloria Grant. Those stories were the ones that I had the most emotional investment in, and the big supervillain aspects of the stories. Sometimes I would come up with a big idea. Sometimes Jim would come up with a big idea. The two of us would toss it around, and then that would become, the story. So if something takes a character away from its previous incarnation, the odds are that would be something that Jim would come up with, because I was, as I say, I was the second, the number 2 writer on that series, and as such, I didn't have, the real authority to just say, hey, you know what, I want to take a Hobgoblin, who's now a major tier Spider-Man villain, and completely change some aspect of his powers. So I would not necessarily have said that. So Jim would be the one who might have come up with that notion.
Also around this period, you used the Punisher in a multi-part story, and you had a villain called the Persuader. And what I enjoyed about that is you did a great job building up the Persuader for him to die. And I don't think a lot of writers would necessarily have the nerve to just kill him off like that, the way you did there.
Again, it's about making the stories feel like they have some consequence. Remind me, was this when Punisher when I was doing that storyline? Was this before or after the Punisher had become big again?
He'd been very popular. I'm not sure. He'd had his limited series in 85, I think it was, or 86. I'm not sure if the regular series by Mike Baron had started at this point. It might have been just right after this or during, at the early point.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think the reason I was able to get him for that book was because there wasn't a lot going on with him, and I have this tendency with my when I'm writing characters that I've written before, that if I have the opportunity to bring back, you know, a villain or a superhero that I created and it felt like it kind of had been sidetracked or lost, I want to bring him back and try to pump him up and reintroduce him. I did that at DC with Firestorm, of course. That's how we got Firestorm back, with Dixon, you know, with Commander Steel, and at Marvel. My impression, and it may be totally wrong, but my impression is that while Punisher was tracking as somebody that readers liked, I don't think he had become as ubiquitous as he became in the 90s.
No.
You know, where he was, yeah.
He might have had his own series. He might have just gotten his own series, but he was not starring in like 3 or 4 books at that point.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I was just simply trying to stir the pot for, you know, a character that I liked.
Let me ask a little bit about some of the DC stuff, because a lot's changed since 2013, because, like, you know, Firestorm, I think in Vibe, they've got, like, a TV show. I was going to ask you about Vibe. I'm guessing, you know, Vibe ended up being an investment you probably didn't expect to pay off like this down the road.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I'm very happy with all of the versions of these characters that I created in the 80s for DC that are now popping up all over almost every DC movie and TV show. So that's very flattering. But I am really, really happy over Vibe, and I have to give lots and lots of credit to Jeff Johns, you know, for redeveloping the character when in Justice League when he reintroduced him a few years ago. Because, you know, that was a character that was created with the best of intentions to be the first real Hispanic superhero, but it was created by a middle-class Irish white guy who didn't really have any grasp of Hispanic culture and Hispanic street culture, or, you know, didn't have very many Hispanic friends and didn't really know what he was doing. So, you know, I've been told by a number of people who would know, you know, that that version of Vibe that I created was considered fairly offensive. And I'm really glad that they found a way to reintroduce him and make him a much less cliche, you know, take on the character. And it's really nice because the Justice League Detroit series was so badly handled by DC at the time, and was so rejected by the more vocal fans, you know, of DC, that it's kind of feels like a triumph, you know, that these characters have come back. I want Gypsy to have her own series next. You know, I want her to show up and be on Legends of Tomorrow. That would make me very happy. I would love to do a new Gypsy series, because I think she was a character I had a lot of plans for, and just never had the opportunity to bring those to fruition.
We talked about this last time, because I listened to the previous interviews to make sure I didn't cover the same ground. We spoke about the Justice League and how it's kind of difficult because some people think the Justice League is like the Avengers. I don't necessarily think that, because the Avengers can be very fluid. You can do new lineups of Avengers and maybe only have Cap or Iron Man on there, and people will kind of go for the ride. With Justice League, it's a little more difficult, because if you don't have the Big Seven, or at least Green Lantern, Flash, and Wonder Woman, and maybe Martian Manhunter, it becomes... people are not as receptive to it, either consciously or subconsciously.
Well, I think that Justice League, certainly at the time that I made that change, we're talking about a book that had been around for about 25 years at that point, or almost 25 years, with pretty much the same top level cast. The cast had expanded, tremendously. I mean, we had new characters like Red Tornado and Firestorm, and Zatanna, and so on. But the core group of Superman, Batman, Flash, and Green Lantern, had remained a part of that cast. So there was a sense of continuity that I just disrupted rather dramatically. I was attempting to do what Stan Lee had done in Avengers 20, I think it was.
Yeah.
Where he got rid of the main characters and brought in a second tier group of characters for the same reasons that I did with the JLA. He had found it increasingly difficult to write stories that involved conflict and continuity between the characters in the book, because each of them had their own series where the main storyline was taking place. And as that was fine for Justice League, it was fine that was the case for most of the time that DC was doing the book, because nothing really was happening, in these other characters' main books. I mean, in the Flash and Green Lantern and Batman and in Superman, for most of the time that the Justice League was around, up until the early 80s, those series were fairly static. There was no major changes. There were no dramatic departures. There was no continuity to speak of. So you could have those characters appear in every issue of Justice League, and you could do stories where there'd be conflict in between them if you wanted to, and it didn't really step on anything. But in the 80s, both DC was trying really hard to start developing the same kind of strong, character-driven series in Superman and Batman, Flash, and Green Lantern that Marvel had been doing with their main characters. And I was starting to find it hard to write stories that would involve those characters in the ways that I needed to. So I thought, well, I can just do what Stan did, but which you really can't when you have 25 years of history. That was the big problem there.
The funny thing is, though, when the Justice League Detroit ended, they did the post-crisis Justice League, which ended up doing very similar to what you did with the lineup that wasn't really the traditional lineup, because they weren't allowed to use Superman, Wonder Woman, or even Flash.
Right.
And it ended up being successful. Do you think that maybe that if you had it done a few years of a non-traditional league, that would have been as receptive as well?
I think the problem with the Justice League that I did was I don't think the sales were particularly bad on the book. I don't think that the book was as badly received as it was perceived to have been.
Right.
I think what was really happening there was that DC had lost faith in its older writers, and by older, I was in my early mid-30s. I was not like older, but they had started to believe their own storytelling. That these characters these books had to have hot, fresh, young faces working on them, and that if they only had that, these books would be much more popular and sell much better. So it wasn't even so much that Justice League Detroit failed as that DC expected it to fail, and didn't give it the support that it really deserved, and undercut the book almost from the beginning by saddling it with an editor who had never edited comic books before or written them or had anything to do with comics other than being a fan, and kind of didn't give it the promotional support that we really expected that it should have. And they were also anticipating, that Crisis would reboot their line and enable them to freshen things up and change things and, make it all better. So they were really just looking for an excuse by that point to go in another direction.
Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you created Jason Todd, didn't you?
Yep.
Okay, now the story goes about the creation of Jason Todd is that there was kind of a conflict over Dick Grayson as Robin appearing in Teen Titans and Batman.
Right. Well, it was that, and again, this is sort of similar to what the situation with Justice League. Marv was writing Teen Titans as a very tightly plotted and character-driven series, where the relationships between the characters were crucial to the story, in the book. So you want those relationships to have consequence and meaning. But if Robin is also appearing in the Batman books and is having separate adventures where something might affect him in Batman, but it's not reflected in what's going on in Teen Titans, and vice versa, you lose credibility in both titles,
right.
and it just weakens the stories for both books. So I had wanted actually a younger version of Robin in any event. I felt that I was trying to do the Batman of an updated, but basically the Batman of the 50s and 60s. The crime-solving detective Batman up against outlandish villains. Have these intricately bizarre plots. And I wanted him to have Robin as his sidekick, sort of, bring back that kind of nostalgic feeling the book had. And so when Mark and I were talking about this, when the conversation came up at DC, I was like, well, can we just, keep Robin, but it doesn't have to be Dick Grayson, And so Marv went and, created Nightwing, and I went and created Jason Todd. So that was how we sort of split the difference.
If you don't mind me asking, because I know this was maybe a year or two ago, there was an issue with some characters appearing on the TV show Gotham that you created, and that I remember at the time it was something said the DC said that they wouldn't give a royalty because it was a derivative character.
Right.
Is that still an issue?
Yeah, it's still an issue. I mean, we've agreed not to fight over it anymore, but we don't agree about the basic concept. The reality is that it's an arbitrary distinction that DC came up with. I guess because I don't know what their motives are. You could argue that some people would say, oh, they just don't want to pay people, but they do pay people. They pay people for a lot of things. I think it may be that they were trying to rationalize a system that had been kind of arbitrary before that. They used to give out contracts for new characters at a fairly indiscriminate way. That some person would receive one, some other person might not receive one, but all they had to do was ask for it, and so on. But they were always careful, to some degree, to separate that out from characters that they called derivative. And I was not aware of the fact that Power Girl had been considered to be a derivative character, because for years I was getting checks for things that where there had been a toy Power Girl, I would receive, what looked like a royalty from it, for it. So my assumption was that was considered part of the same thing, And then this comes up, and I think it was in context of not in Gotham, it was on the Flash, that Caitlin Snow, who is a character that is functionally the same as Crystal Frost, who is a character that I created, who becomes Killer Frost. But Caitlin Snow is the name that they gave to the slightly younger version of the character. Somehow that character was considered to be derivative of my character, but because it was derivative, DC wasn't going to be paying a royalty or a shared equity payment to the creator of that character, but they weren't going to be paying me either.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, wait. I mean, if you're saying that it's a derivative character, therefore it doesn't, the person who derived the character doesn't get any payment for it, shouldn't that mean that the person who the character was derived from should get the payment for it?
Yeah, it's like if somebody was getting a payment, that'd be one thing, but if they're trying, it makes it seem a lot more, it's sneaky. It seems dishonest.
Yeah, it seems a little bit weird. And similarly, if you look at the credits for the Batman Robin cartoon that came out last year, Nightwing has a credit to Marv Wolfman and George Perez as the creators of Nightwing, but I do not have a credit as the creator. I and Don Perlin do not have a credit as the creator of Jason Todd. How can this possibly be?
Yeah,
right?
No, it doesn't make sense. And Power Girl is, you could just look at Power Girl's personality, her costume, her look. You wouldn't even know she was Supergirl, related to Supergirl, if you didn't know it from the stories, just looking at her, and her personality is almost a 180.
Yeah. No, I think DC does have potentially a legitimate interest in not treating these characters exactly the same as they treat totally original creations. I think that's totally legit. But to pretend that that they were not created is specious. It's just not accurate. If you want to reduce the amount of money that you give to someone as a creator of a derivative character, fine. But you can't just say it wasn't created, because it's nonsensical.
Yeah, it didn't spring from Zeus. It didn't spring from Zeus's forehead.
Yeah. As one person said, if you want to talk about derivative, every character after Superman is a derivative character. There are no superheroes if you didn't have Superman. So I would just say it's kind of it's an argument. As I say, I'm not going to fight with DC about it anymore. But I don't agree with their interpretation.
Yeah, and you're probably doing pretty good right now with Firestorm and Vibe and the various other TV characters. But in some ways, it's more of a principle.
I don't think that I don't think this is an intentional an intentional deceitful act on their part. I just think that it's something where they sort of talk themselves into a untenable position, and for legitimate reasons. And it's just one that I hope over time they'll come around and see a more sensible a way to approach it.
I wanted to ask you about some of your recent work with Carnage. Carnage is there's a lot about things I like about Carnage, and again, you gotta understand, I was a kid when he was around and he looked cool, but I noticed a lot of older Spider-Man writers seem to greatly dislike him and Venom.
Right.
But when you wrote the book, and I was skeptical when I heard there was a Carnage book until I heard your name, and I'm being honest here, when I heard your name, I knew you would do a good job on it.
Well, I appreciate that, but it could still have been a bad book.
But where did you get the idea to create the atmosphere? Because I've been thinking of it as almost a horror book.
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
almost like Tomb of Dracula.
I was approached by Nick Lowe, who's the editor of the Spider-Man group of books, to do the book, and it was actually Nick's idea, which I embraced and took and ran with. That we do it where Carnage is the object of the book, not the subject, but the subject of the book are the people pursuing Carnage, and that Carnage is the Dracula, as Nick said. Let's do a new version of Dracula. Tomb of Dracula, which I had written the first couple of issues of that book, and I love the idea of doing a horror book. I think that there's something to be said for those kinds of that kind of slow build up of suspense and horror, and the idea that there's an impending larger force, waiting in the shadows, and that our characters have one set of goals and our antagonist has another set of goals, and those drag you into a larger, dramatic situation. So there wasn't much of a hard sell on either of our parts for how we were going to do it. Once Nick proposed it, and we agreed on an approach, it's been a lot of fun to do.
And I really enjoyed that. I was very happy to see John Jameson, and especially, when he turned into Man-Wolf, that just made me very happy because I was hoping for it, but I wasn't gonna when I saw the movie Ant-Man, I had to ask my friend for a spoiler. I said, "Does he turn into Giant Man?" And the reason I asked this was, if I didn't know one way or another, I'd spend the whole movie waiting for it.
Right.
And it would kind of ruin my experience if I did. So here, I wasn't going to put all my hopes on him turning into Man-Wolf, but I really wanted it, and that made me so happy when I saw it.
That's great. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And I also used Eddie Brock in here, and again, Eddie Brock's another character that it tends to be that a lot of the older Spider-Man writers before his creation don't really care for him.
Yeah.
And
I don't know. I didn't have much. I wasn't writing the series when both of those characters came around. So I was able to look at them as part of the mythos now. And just sort of look at and see what values can I get out of them as characters for this story. And yeah, they're a bit. They're a bit hard to sort of track where they are, in one sense, because Eddie Brock, has gone from being a bad guy to a good guy to a bad guy to a crazy guy. It's like he's been a bit all over the place. And Carnage, as a crazy person, there's like a rule of thumb among writers that lunatics are bad characters because they don't have a rational worldview, so their motivations are arbitrary, and that makes them less interesting. Yeah. I tend to think it sort of depends upon the writer giving that character a motivation that is relatable, and you keep the aspects of the character that fans like his weird sense of humor, his viciousness, his twisted view of the world, but give him a goal, and now suddenly you're not stuck in that random craziness, that makes that character difficult for readers to feel emotionally invested in. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, the way I kind of always saw Cletus Cassidy, especially the way you wrote him, is I see. He seems like he's a serial killer with delusions of grandeur. Because if you look at him, the only thing that made him special initially is that he happened to be put in a cell with Eddie Brock, and for him, that gave him the ideal that he was more than he was.
Right.
And when he got, I'm sorry, but when did you get the ideal to include the Darkhold?
Well, that came when we started talking about doing it as a horror book. It just, as I said to you a little while ago, I like to include my old stuff, partly to amuse myself, partly for the readers who have followed me, and they may want to see something that I did, and enjoy seeing it again. And also, I like the Darkhold as a MacGuffin, as a story tool that I felt had a lot of possibilities. I've always liked Lovecraft. I've always liked the idea of elder gods and strange forces of beyond our human understanding, and the Darkhold was a thinly veiled homage to the Necromonicon of Lovecraft. So, when I started thinking about the horror books that I'd written back in the early 70s for Marvel, Darkhold was a very prominent feature of Werewolf by Night, so I figured that would be a good thing to include.
Speaking of, let me use this as a segue back into maybe your 80s Marvel work. And it's interesting, though, you have worked at Marvel in very different eras.
We have to tie it up in
I was going to go back to when you created the Lobo Brothers.
Right.
Where did that ideal come along?
Well, I think it was a continuation of my desire to do something with Hispanic characters. That vibe was representative of that. I just felt that was a market that, as a writer, I hadn't been serving, and I wanted to use it. Plus, I think there was a music group at that time called El Lobo, and I really liked that music. So creating the Lobo Brothers, is sort of a tribute in one sense to that band. Los Lobos was the name of the group.
Now, when you created them, did you know they were going to be mutants, or did you think of maybe making them an actual werewolf like Werewolf by Night?
No, I mean, it starts off with, when you're creating characters, it starts off with a concept, and then you start whittling it down and trying to come up with what's the most effective and best way to address it. And I think when you're talking about brothers, the odds that you'd have two werewolf brothers is kind of slim, but two mutant brothers, that sort of fits.
Right. Now, one of the things doing is Kingpin shows up occasionally, and I think one of my favorite moments during Inferno is when Kingpin punches a demon and it turns to dust, and I kind of said to myself, still got it. Were there any rules put on you as regards to using Kingpin? Was it, because I know at that point he was thought of primarily as a Daredevil villain.
Yeah, I don't recall. A lot of the specifics of which character gets used, especially if it was a one shot or a couple of shots, were, I really don't remember whether there was any real push one way or the other. I mean, it's like the Captain Universe story that we did. I mean, that came out, it was done for reasons that have nothing to do with my desire to do that story, so.
Yeah.
You just sort of do it, move on to the next one that you do. But I always liked Kingpin. I always thought, he was a Spider-Man villain,
yeah,
so, I should be able to use him.
Yeah, that's what I think. I always think of Kingpin as primarily as a Spider-Man villain because I never really read Daredevil when I was a kid, but I would read old Marvel Tales reprints of Spider-Man.
Right.
And I always thought of Kingpin.
Yeah. Daredevil. He didn't become a Daredevil villain until Frank Miller did the book.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, Daredevil had his own master villains, you know, like the Owl and so on, and the Magia, you know, those people. So you didn't need Woken Fisks, but I guess Miller, you know, really wanted to draw a gigantic egg-shaped person, so that's what he got to do.
Now, and the main thing I wanted to ask about was Tombstone. Let me ask you one question about Tombstone. And it's almost kind of awkward to ask, but because Tombstone's an albino, was he born to a black family?
Yes.
Okay, I was just wanting to make sure, and there's no good way to ask that.
Well, no, I mean, albinos can be born to anybody. But,
right. Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah, he was a childhood friend of Robbie Robertson, and in their generation, it was not likely that he just wasn't likely to be friends with a white family.
Yeah.
You know, somebody growing up in the 40s and 50s, there was not a lot of desegregated environments for them to become buddies.
What brought about the ideal? What gave you the inspiration for Tombstone?
For Tombstone?
Yeah.
Well, it was the same kind of inspiration that led me to create Hammerhead. I thought that one of the things that Spider-Man did well was the Dick Tracy-esque crime lord. You know, the crime master, you know, the Hammerhead, the big man, you know, the enforcers. These were, you know, in the style and general approach, you know, of a Dick Tracy gangster. And I wanted to do an updated version of that. And I don't know specifically where I came up with the name for Tombstone or the look or whatever, but it just felt right, you know. And it was one of those things that, because I wanted to do a story that featured Robbie Robertson, making him, you know, getting him a relationship with Robbie Robertson, made it, you know, personal. So that was important to me.
One thing that's really gratifying when you're reading something, or you're watching a TV show, you know how you'll have a question about a plot, and what I always appreciate with a writer is if they actually answered the question in the story. Because I was thinking in the Tombstone story near the end when he's fighting Spider-Man, I was thinking, why didn't he just kill Robbie? And,
you know, he may hate him, you know, but it's much more fun to torture somebody emotionally. He's a bully.
And when he said that was his friend, you know, and you got the feeling that he actually meant that. He considered him a friend, or as close to a friend as he could have.
Yeah, I mean, he's a twisted sociopath, you know, so his definition of friend might not be the same as ours.
Also, I would also say that I also appreciated that about when you did the Evolutionary War story, that somebody sent a letter in and they said, "What about Carrion?" Is that how you say it?
Who?
Carrion, the Miles Warren clone.
Oh. Right. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with Carrion at that point because that was again, happened when I wasn't around, so I didn't really know about it. I didn't even know for years that Carrion was Miles Warren. It's like, okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, but I thought it was handled really well in the follow-up story, you know, because a lot of people might have just tried to ignore it or not dealt with it, but I appreciate that you deal with things like that head on.
Well, yeah. You should always address things if you can. Anyway, I have to wind it up.
Okay,
but,
I guess...
I hope it was helpful.
Okay, so you, just to help you promote something, I know you're doing an upcoming Spider-Man graphic novel, is it?
No, a series. We're doing a new ongoing series, Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows with Ryan Stegman as my artist, collaborator. And it's set in the world, or a version of the world that was introduced in the Renew Your Vows miniseries, in which Peter Parker and Mary Jane Parker stay married, and they have a 10-year-old daughter. She has superpowers, and they're sort of the Spider family. So it's a lot of fun.
Okay. Again, I wanted to ask about that. I know you can't go into too many details about it. Again, thank you so much for everything. I greatly appreciate the time, and also I've really enjoyed all the stories I've been reading. It wasn't really work at all to research it.
I'm glad. Well, thank you so much for the conversation.
That's no problem. Thanks again. You have a good night.
You too. Take care, Victor.
All right. Bye bye.